let's get started. This is I guess you would want to call it the lecture 2, which will, like lecture 1, be a series of videos broken up, and so they're not too long. In this video, in this lecture rather, what we'll be describing is some of the basic economic conceptual ideas that then, kind of feed into environmental economics and will kind of carry us through many of the topic areas that we get to. So a lot of what we'll be talking about today will be sort of a framing and how we frame various environmental problems moving forward, as well as potential solutions to environmental problems. And really kind of we'll sort of set that nice foundation for ourselves. Previous to this lecture, I had asked you to read a few things. One of those things that I asked you to read was the Fullerton and Stavins 2005 piece, which, lays out, how do economists see the environment. And I think it's interesting that this, piece exists in the first place, because it underscores, I think, the historical blind spot that I talked about in the last video that economics had towards the environment, that there even needs to be a document which explains to people that the modern economist does not see the environment in the way potentially that the historical economist view was, which was really just to see the environment as an input to a production function and, to be used in the effort of economic growth. Now, it's certainly true that in order to grow the economy, we almost certainly have to cause some level of environmental degradation. At the same time, there is some question nowadays, more so than there used to be, about how much economic growth do we really need, and should economic growth even necessarily be our main focus. And to this point, I listened to a really interesting podcast over the weekend from our friends at Economics, and they had several scholars on who that in fact, maximizing economic growth as a policy tool, or I should say as a policy goal, is not necessarily what we want to be doing. And there are other factors that we can seek to optimize aside from economic growth that could potentially be much more sustainable, much more inclusive of environmental concerns, and also potentially inclusive of other social issues, not just with respect to the environment, but with respect to income inequality and issues such as that. Regardless, the Fullerton and Stavins piece does, I think, a really good job of kind of laying out there how economists tend to view the environment and really dispelling of several myths. The myth that economists think that markets are the solution to everything. I mean, even folks who tend to be quote unquote free market economists will often admit that there are times when markets do not quote unquote solve everything. But beyond that, in the context of solving issues, there are a number of environmental problems we know that not only will markets not solve them on their own, but the core problem lies with the market itself and with the inherent incentives that are at play in the market. And that's a lot of what we'll be talking about today when we start talking about markets. And we'll talk about the notion of the internal incentives that consumers and producers face in markets, and how these are really the root cause of a lot of our environmental problems. And like I said, could potentially become sources of solution to our environmental problems. The price of a product reflects the true value of that given product. There's this sort of obsession in economics with prices, and the prices that we pay with goods being an accurate measure of the value of something, to the environment. And this is really important because the market-based economic system and the way that we think about it is heavily reliant upon the idea of pricing signals. What I mean by pricing signals is that pricing signals are what markets pay attention to when they are sending capital and labor throughout an economy. So if, for example, there's a market where the price of a product is rising, because demand has been increasing, then the market, the quote unquote invisible hand, will respond by sending capital and labor into that particular market. A good example of this is the personal computer. So in the 50s and 60s, there was virtually very few jobs or any jobs in personal computing. But then in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, as the demand for personal computing up, the price of computers went up. And then as a result, what you had was this massive influx in capital and labor into the personal computing industry, to the extent that innovation occurred so quickly that in fact the price of computing has done nothing but fall over time. And that certainly isn't because of demand decreases. If in fact nothing but an increase has occurred in the demand for technology and personal computing, but it's just that because so much capital and labor flowed into that as people were starting to buy more and more personal computers, this overall had a very positive effect on the cost of technology. So, there's a good example of where a market and the tendency of the market to flow where things are most profitable is very much a good thing. So technology flowing into personal computing really ultimately democratized personal computing, and it was no longer simply the venue of the wealthy, but in fact nowadays moderate to low income individuals have much greater access to personal computing than they used to. And this occurred again because the market saw this pricing signal in the 80s, sent a bunch of capital and labor into those markets, and we are where we are today. So pricing signals are very important. The economy behaves and revolves around this notion of pricing signals. And if our assumption is that those pricing signals are always quote unquote correct or reflecting of some true value, then we're going to tend to think that whatever the market's doing is efficient, right? And this is the economic kind of story, which is that if you let markets do what they want to do, because markets are paying attention to pricing signals as opposed to making like sort of voluntary human decisions, then therefore there's an inherent efficiency, a supposed efficiency of market behavior. And even if prices are always efficient, which of course we're going to say from the outset is not true, and we'll specifically define how and why prices are not efficient, even if prices are efficient, there's the conversation about is it the only thing that we're concerned about? And increasingly the answer to that question is no, that economists are very much concerned about issues broader than is the economy working efficiently relative to economic growth. It is the economy working efficiently relative to its environmental impact? Is it working efficiently relative to incomes and livelihoods and happiness, for example? So there's a clear need for economists in 2020, unfortunately, to sort of explain that, look, I mean, economists used to think this way, but that has rapidly changed. And as a result, a lot of us believe that this gives economics an opportunity to really, get into, part of the solution-making process. So, again, I hope you enjoyed that reading. It was a very short reading, but it does a really good job of, I think, indicating where we're starting from in this course. And this course is all about teaching you environmental economics. So I think that reading does a good job of kind of setting it up. What we'll do is we'll go through a little bit of economic history and we'll kind of take you from where we were and take you into where we're going. The classical view of economic systems was almost completely macro-based, meaning macroeconomic based, and was really built around this idea of the circular flow. The circular flow, which is largely based on something we call Say's law, which says that supply creates demand. So if you were a country, your goal should be to make as much stuff as possible. And if you make as much stuff as possible, people will buy as much stuff as possible, right? So supply creates demand. Well, if this is the paradigm that you choose to operate under as a country, it's very clear that you're going to put environmental degradation very much on the back burner. If your central goal is to make stuff, to produce stuff, and producing and making stuff necessarily requires environmental degradation in many forms, then you're going to create massive environmental degradation. And of course, this is what occurs. Sort of, if we just kind of start from basically the Industrial Revolution 1850 through the early 1900s in the western part of the world, Europe and the United States. What you see is this rapid economic development built around productive ability. So countries were able to grow themselves very quickly and turn themselves into relatively wealthy countries because they had this productive capacity. They had a natural resource base that gave them part of this productive capacity. And as a result, all of the large economies in the Industrial Revolution were characterized by manufacturing. And even though economists we don't believe Say's law, we certainly don't think that supply creating demand should be an impetus for national economic policy. The fact is that this way of thinking still very much permeates the political and economic ways of thinking. So if you've ever heard the term supply side economics is really just another way of saying we still believe in Say's law, which again, not many economists believe in Say's law. So usually when you hear supply side economics nowadays, it's not coming from an economist, it's coming from a free market advocate. And again, if you're a free market advocate, well, in a sense, it makes sense that you would advocate for a Say's law view of the economy that basically says we should just produce as much as possible, inject that stuff into the economy, and then this will grow the size of the pie over time, because there's this positive feedback loop with economic growth. Consumption leads to production, which leads back to consumption, so on and so forth. And so, this becomes a very potent and very straightforward policy ideology, and it becomes very powerful, and it becomes carried alongside advocacy for capitalist economic systems. Now the truth is that all capitalism means is that you generally allow capital and labor to flow into parts of the economy where they're going to flow, right? That you don't have a person, a government official deciding where capital and labor should go. It's another step to say that you want a capitalist country based upon a Say's law or based upon a circular flow view. That's an additional step, but sometimes those ideas are married, unfortunately. And so this is where supply side and capitalism and as an economic doctrine get sort of smushed together, and it's hard to distinguish. We will talk at length about what I think are the many misconceptions of capitalism, both for its proponents, the people who are most ardently in support of capitalism, and also its detractors, the people who point out very real and very consequential problems with quote unquote capitalist economic systems. And I'll sort of pick apart and kind of criticize both of those positions. And that will be a lot of what we talk about. Because the truth is that even in those countries that we call socialist, like Norway, for example, is often referred to as like a socialist country. Well, if you look at their economy, it's completely market-based. The difference in Norway is that they just have a very large social safety net, and they tax themselves a lot, and they provide goods publicly. But the economy itself, most of the jobs people have come from a private sector. So it's a capitalist economic system. It's just got a more government intervention-based political system. Even a country like China, which is still technically a communist country, but their economy is very much a market-based economic system. It's just that the government is the one that makes all the industrial decisions, for better or for worse. So, I think sometimes we get a little bit lost in defining things in these extremely broad, ways. So we move into sort of the neoclassical folks. So the classical folks are really like 1800s into the early part of the 1900s. And then as we get into the 1900s, what you see is this real formalization of economics as a science. So prior, economics was much more philosophy based, for thinking back to like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill. These folks really saw the economy as this idea of political economy. And it was all about the philosophical notions of economic systems, and the overarching, sort of ideological thrust that came from those folks was a more free market approach to economic systems, so-called laissez-faire economics. Although I'll point out, if you've actually read Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, he talks at length about the concern over market power and the concern over wealthy landowners having disproportionate control over economic systems. So despite the fact that Adam Smith is sort of regarded as this godfather of free market economics, even in Wealth of Nations, he talked at length about the problem of wealth inequality and the problem of market power, issues that of course we're still grappling with and debating on into today. The neoclassical economists were really important because what they did is they started focusing on microeconomic issues. And this is really where microeconomics starts to take off as a discipline. And what microeconomics is that it's a response to this science-based approach to economics where, just like in physics, you can think about celestial bodies, that's like a macro view of the universe, or you can think about it from an atomistic perspective and actually look at like individual atoms and chemical reactions and things like that. That's another way to look at the physical universe. And so in economics, it's very similar. So you can look at things from sort of a 30,000 foot view in terms of productive capacity and GDP and these sorts of issues, or you can think about the economic system as being largely about individual economic decisions being made by consumers and producers and policymakers and so on and so forth. And the undergirding sort of, I would say, philosophy about the neoclassical view is that, again, it's a fairly free market view, and they specifically believe that prices reflect preferences and that the prices of products are economically efficient under a certain set of assumptions. Humans are rational, that's consumers and producers, that consumers are maximizing utility, that just means happiness, producers are maximizing profits, and then that people are rationally self-interested. And here the term rational is substituted with an idea of full information. So if I have full information, I have the capacity to make rational decisions, we're going to assume that people both have information and are able to make those rational decisions. And from this, of course, we get the supply and demand framework of individual markets, which you see here in this particular graph, with the classic downward sloping demand curve and upward sloping supply curve. Now, what is not often talked about as much is that really when you look at this demand curve, it's really a social marginal benefit curve. It's a marginal benefit, it's a demand curve, but it's representing willingness to pay amongst consumers, right? And then the supply curve is a social marginal cost curve. It's reflecting of how much it costs to produce the goods. And where these two curves meet in the middle is, of course, what we regard as economically efficient. And really, when we say economically efficient, we just mean that supply equals demand. We don't have a surplus. That means that supply was greater than demand. And we don't have a shortage, which means that supply was greater than demand. And you can see that at any given price, other than this equilibrium price, we would either have a surplus if the price was greater than the equilibrium, or we would have a shortage if the price was below the equilibrium. So it is truly this equilibrium price that we believe is the most efficient pricing signal. And so the argument goes, well, if you allow this market to equilibrate on its own, and we believe that markets will equilibrate on their own, what you're doing is you're maximizing economic efficiency. And then taking it a step further, if we see demand curves as being social marginal benefit, meaning that individuals make up society, their demand for products is a part of that social function, consuming is a part of the social function, then willingness to pay, which again is what is represented by the demand curve, and that's of course why it's downward sloping. As the price of a good falls, we expect more people to purchase it because more people are going to have lower willingness to pay. So as you move down a demand curve, you pick up more and more and more people willing to purchase the good. And then on the other end of the market with the supply curve, again, this reflects costs. And so you kind of have your low cost firms down here who would be willing to supply the good at very low prices. You have your kind of high cost firms up here who would only be willing to supply the good if prices were sufficiently high. And the market kind of equilibrates somewhere in between. So it doesn't necessarily cater to just high cost firms, and it doesn't necessarily just cater to high willingness to pay consumers. It meets somewhere in the middle. middle, which again is part of that inherent efficiency of economic markets. And so again, the neoclassical view was, as long as these assumptions are met, and as long as these are competitive markets, again, that would be a market that did not have any sort of market power or market concentration, you know, many firms, then we have what we call efficient prices. Prices are efficiently sending those signals. Capital and labor are moving about the economy, therefore, in an efficient way. And so this is where you get that free market is, you know, economically efficient. And taken a step further, if a free market is economically efficient, and if we think about demand and supply as being made up of society, then the neoclassical view essentially was that free markets produce maximal social efficiency as well. So not only do they maximize economic efficiency, but they also subsequently maximize social efficiency. This will definitely be something that we, you know, if not outright reject pretty soon, are certainly going to call into question and wonder if it is true, and suggest that it is not. Then we had what we call the welfare economists. So the welfare economists come along and they take this idea that we're going to consider individual economic decisions, and they now want to distinguish, you know, in a sense from, you know, efficient positions and inefficient positions. So there's this view of the economy called the Pareto frontier, which is the blue line here. And generally you can think about it as similar to a production possibilities frontier curve that you may have seen in Principles of Economics. And basically what it does is it represents the maximum level of production that can be achieved in an economic system. And, you know, sometimes you won't look at, you know, products produced here, but instead what you'll look at is like consumer happiness. And so what it enables us to do is to now kind of consider, you know, well, you can have things be economically efficient, but it doesn't necessarily mean that's what's best for society. So for example, if you look at this particular graph, you'll see that this point B is efficient. It's efficient because it's on the frontier, which means it's using all of our resources in an efficient manner. But you'll notice that this is a lot of guns and very, very, very little butter. This is the classic economic guns versus butter thing. And so the idea is that it could be economically efficient to produce this high number of guns and this low number of butter, but from a social perspective, that may not necessarily be true. That it certainly could be the case that despite the fact that you have economic efficiency, it doesn't necessarily translate into social efficiency. And then the other thing that this does is it establishes for us a potential view of improvement. So for example, if we're at a Pareto efficient point, which would be point A, let's assume that we can create a policy that would move us to a new point. Now, we can establish for ourselves general rules, and those general rules may be we would only want to move in a Pareto improvement fashion. And specifically what Pareto improvement would mean is that we move to the frontier neither by reducing butter production or reducing gun production. Or again, if this is, you know, happiness of person A and happiness of person B, we could increase the happiness of both parties without decreasing the happiness of the other. Or in this case, increasing the production of one good without decreasing the production of another. So if we're at Pareto inefficient positions, we can move to Pareto efficient positions in a Pareto improvement way, which would specifically mean moving to the frontier in a way that doesn't reduce the production of the other goods or doesn't reduce the happiness of the individuals, if that's the specific framework that we're working on. Your lecture notes that I gave you to read, they look at this problem specifically from a human happiness perspective. So, you know, this gives you a chance to kind of see it in multiple ways. And then beyond just this notion that a market is going to equilibrate at a particular place, that's going to put us somewhere in this Pareto framework, there also is the, you know, what we call the welfare theorems of economics, the first fundamental welfare theorem and the second fundamental welfare theorem. The first one is a very free market view, and it basically says that competitive markets lead to Pareto optimal positions under the neoclassical assumption. So it's really a carryover from the neoclassical view, and again says basically that we should allow markets to do what they want. They will naturally create Pareto optimal positions. The reason why we assume this is because if you have consumers maximizing utility, producers maximizing profits, then there's an assumption assumption there that those decisions are themselves going to be inherently efficient. But the problem is, as we will repeatedly say, is that this notion of economic efficiency, the competitive markets lead to Pareto optimality, is that Pareto optimality says nothing about equity. It says nothing about the overall, health of society. In fact, you could be on the Pareto frontier all the way to the extent that you're not doing any of the other activity. And this point here would technically be Pareto efficient and economically efficient, but you can see that we wouldn't be producing any butter at all. Or again, if this is people's happiness, which is a little bit more acute way of looking at it, you would be giving all of the happiness to one individual and giving none to another. And that would technically be, Pareto efficient. This is clearly not a position that we actually want in society, right? We generally want things to be close to the middle. We want things to be fairly equal across individuals. And so then you get the second Pareto, the second fundamental welfare theorem, which says that any Pareto optimal position can be achieved through redistribution, would mean that wherever we end up, we can always redistribute ourselves to another, preferred Pareto optimal position. So this is what we do with, say, progressive taxation in the United States, is that we tax wealthy individuals, we take some of that money and we use it to fund things like public education and public infrastructure, subsidize college experiences for low-income individuals. And that's a means to redistribute the economic gains of your society from the rich to the poor. And this can still be an economically efficient thing to do. So the second fundamental welfare theorem is crucially important in a world where we're ultimately going to question whether free markets lead to fully compensated cost. In fact, what we'll talk about is how free markets lead to costs borne on third parties who didn't really even benefit from the market, but they pay some cost as being produced by the market.